Today on Ancient Insight, we will be taking a look at the abstract English concept of fear as it appears in Proverbs, or MaSHaLaY 1:7. Fear of Yahweh, beginning of knowledge, wisdom, and discipline. Fools they despise. Fear plays a prominent role in all of our daily lives. We are often encouraged by modern culture to not be afraid, to have no fear, to face our fears and conquer them so that we can move forward in our lives uninhibited. It isn't only modern culture that tells us this. The phrase "fear not" occurs at least 62 times in the King James translation of the Bible. However, all of this encouragement is thrown into confusion when we arrive at the promise of Proverbs 1:7, a promise that when we fear Yahweh, knowledge, wisdom, and discipline will flow into our lives. So how is it that fear, something we can spend much of our lives avoiding and challenging, can suddenly become a source of knowledge, wisdom, and discipline? The answer to that question can be found on a mountaintop, in a river, and in the movements of a ball. All of these relate back to the ancient Hebrew word yar. Let's dig in and see if this amazing word can help us draw a better picture of fear that can change the way we think and live. The word which is translated into English as fear in Proverbs 1:7 is yar. Yar is a parent word, and just like physical parents, it is composed of two individual characters which join together to form a new concept, a combination of the previously separate character traits that produces children. With physical families, you can learn a lot about children by examining their parents, and you can learn a lot about parents by examining the children they produce. The same holds true with parent words. In the case of yar, it is the characters yod and resh which are married or united. The yod is a picture of an arm and hand, and its character is defined by the functions of those parts of our bodies. Arms and hands function in combination to work, make, strike, gather, hold, and throw whatever our minds tell them to. The arm and hand team is the part of our bodies that allows us to physically exert the will of our mind onto the world around us in order to affect, impact, and change it. When we compare all the different functions the arm and hand accomplish, we can begin to determine the core notion, main idea, or defining character represented by the yod: power, the ability to do. When I'm exploring the effect that yod has on the words in which it forms, I find it helpful to use synonyms for power such as effect, impact, work, action, function, and result. Now let's look at the resh. The pictograph for the resh is a picture of a head of a person, and the word resh is defined by the action to inherit, as well as the concrete objects head, top, and summit. By comparing the functions of the objects and the actions which define resh, and looking for a common theme between them, we can determine its core notion. The action word inherit means to receive something from a greater, older, or more powerful source. That source may be greater due to its wealth, its rank, or its age. But any way we look at it, inherit paints a picture of something flowing down from a higher to a lower position. A head, whether it is the head of a human or the head of a nail, is the highest point which receives stimulus or information and transmits it to its lower parts. The common element in these concepts of inherit and head is a flowing down from higher to lower, which seems to indicate that the core notion, idea, or character behind the letter resh is supremacy, the state of being in the highest station of power. When I'm exploring the effect that resh has on the words it's found in, I find it helpful to use synonyms for head such as top, summit, supreme, lead, greatest, superior, or most high. Now that we are familiar with the characters of the individual letters, we're ready to bring them together. When the yod, power, comes together with the resh, summit. They form the word yar. The combination of their pictographs seems to indicate that yar is the power of the summit. Or substituting some synonyms, it could also be expressed as the effect of supremacy, the function of elevation, or the action of the highest. So what is the power of a summit? What do mountains do? What effect do superior things have on the inferior things they interact with? They throw. They cause movement. Throwing is what happens when a greater source applies its power to a lesser object, compelling it to move forward. Skiers glide. Rivers flow. And avalanches plummet down the sides of mountains in responsive demonstrations of this power. Now it begins to make sense that the word yar is often translated into English as the verb throw. We can see evidence of this concept at work when we look at one of the child roots formed by the yod-resh parent root, and that is yar, yod-al-resh, meaning river. The addition of the pictograph al, a picture of an ox, adds the idea of influence or being led by. A river is a body of water which is led, moved, driven by, and constantly under the influence of the power of a summit. In other words, it is thrown down by the mountain or high elevation where it originates. Another child word which comes from the yod-resh parent root is yara, yod-resh-he, a word which means teach. I found this to be a strange addition to the family until I realized that every river, stream, or creek that you come across in your life is a teacher, with a quick and short lesson that sounds something like this. I am being compelled to move forward by a source which is greater than me. You can find that source by tracing my path backwards. Similarly, when we look at the concept of throwing, whether we are looking at a baseball or a bullet, every object which has been thrown has the same lesson to tell as the river. I am being compelled to move forward by a source which is greater than me. You can find that source by tracing my path backwards. This concrete lesson, offered by the river and the ball, becomes particularly helpful as we use it to shed light on the abstract concept of fear. A person who is experiencing fear has the same story to tell as the river and the ball. I'm being compelled to move forward by a source which is greater than me. You can find that source by tracing my path backwards. Fear, according to this ancient scriptural perspective, can be described as moving forward in compliance with the direction of a greater force. Notice that from this perspective, yar, or fear, is an active state and not a passive emotion. The passive emotions, which we commonly call fear in English, can be found in the scriptures as the Hebrew word chat, meaning to dread or to be broken, as well as the word maurak, which means faint, feeble, or inactive. These passive emotions are similar to yar in that they all take place in the presence of a superior and commanding force. But yar sets itself apart by describing a responsive action, a certain and confident forward movement initiated by a dominant source. My initial confusion with Proverbs 1:7 came from my mistaken impression that fear was a passive emotion, a frozen, locked down, and broken state of dread or timidness. It's hard to imagine that wisdom, knowledge, and correction could emerge from such a state. It's much easier to understand that these blessings will come to those who are thrown forward in compliance with the power of the Most High, those who are flowing in accordance with His direction. We have an idiom in modern English which I think accurately describes the insight behind the concept of yar, and that is the phrase, under the influence. Substituting this phrase for yar, or fear, tells us that being, living, acting, or producing under the influence of Yahuwah is the beginning of wisdom, knowledge, and correction. There are many things in life which are stronger than we are, many things which have the capacity to exert influence over us, things that we characterize as fears. It can almost seem like we are a ball in a pinball machine, bouncing back and forth from one dominant force to another, trying to do what each commands. But a concrete picture of a mountain gives us an alternative to this chaotic and random picture. It begins to show that there is a hierarchy of influence, a chain of command that can bring order, wholeness, and proper function to our lives once we see it. Our Messiah shows us an example of this hierarchy of influence in Matthew 6:25 through 34, as he addresses several concepts which are above us on the mountain, in a position to exert power over us, or in other words, things we commonly fear: starvation, thirst, exposure in the form of inadequate clothing, and uncertainty about the future. These concepts exert influence over us by threatening our physical life, and then command us to worry about their influence and prioritize them above all else. Notice how the Messiah instructs us to look beyond them and their demands, to look further up the mountain, further up the chain of influence, realizing that even though the issues of food, water, shelter, and stability do exert influence over us, the Most High is stronger than they are. He resides at the highest position of influence, over and above all other concerns. When we seek His kingdom, prioritizing His instructions, He can and will and does exert His influence over the lower influences, providing us with sustenance, hydration, shelter, and stability. For another example of this hierarchy of influence, look at Matthew 4:1 through 11, when the Messiah was tested by the adversary who offers him the kingdoms of the world and all their glory. Notice where they are standing, on the summit of a mountain. Now notice the condition of the adversary's bargain. The Messiah must lower himself down and worship the accuser. In other words, he must place himself under the adversary's influence and follow his instructions. The word translated as worship here is proskuneo, a Greek word meaning to lower oneself before another. Again, this would establish our picture of a dominant force assuming a position of power by standing over a subordinate, elevated on a mountain. Messiah's response to this proposal is a perfect demonstration of the yar, or fear of Yahuwah, by asserting that Yahuwah is the only one we are to worship and serve. There's another remarkable demonstration of this concept found in one of the most memorized and quoted verses of Scripture, Psalm 23. In the poetic scene beginning at verse 4, David describes himself as walking in a valley or gorge, something which lies at the foot of a mountain. He then describes this valley as being in shadow, an area of darkness caused by something standing in between him and the light. He describes this light-blocking object as death, one of the leading fears among humanity. He then indicates that even though he finds himself in this situation where a dominant force stands above him, exerting influence, he will not serve it. He will not obey its command to fumble around in the dark and lose his way. David declares that he will not fear evil because he recognizes that Yahuwah is above it, exerting his influence and control over it, providing guidance, sustenance, and protection. When I find myself afraid of something, I try to picture the image of the mountain and remind myself that the reason that I'm scared is because I'm facing something which is stronger, greater, higher up the mountain than I am, and therefore in a position to affect me, to cause me to act under its influence. But before I accept that influence and do as it is instructing, I must ask the question, is this greater force standing above me actually standing at the top of the mountain? Looking beyond the thing which is scaring me reveals that it is not at the summit, the supreme or the most high. There is something above it. It would be a mistake for me to follow its instructions or act under its influence, especially if what it is telling me to do contradicts the instructions given by the Most High, a title which is given to Yahweh alone at least 48 times in the Scriptures. Recognizing Him as the Most High, it is His instructions alone that should be followed. Thank you for watching.